Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are sitting. And welcome to the webinar today on energy and environmental initiatives that are arising from the Biden presidency. It is part of a series that we at McGuireWoods are doing on the first 100 days of the Biden administration. My name is Allison Wood. I'm a partner at McGuireWoods. My focus is environmental and specifically climate change. And I am joined today by my partner, Aaron Flynn, and then our Vice President of Government Relations in our McGuireWoods Consulting lobbying arm, Katie Gregory, and then also Bernie Mcnamee, who is a partner at McGuireWoods and also a senior advisor to McGuireWoods Consulting and a former FERC commissioner. And the four of us today are going to be talking about a variety of issues that we see in the energy and environmental space that will be affecting folks as we move forward in the new administration. And what I'm going to start with today is a brief discussion and overview of ESG issues. And for those who may have been under a rock and unfamiliar with ESG, it stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance Issues. ESG has, the idea of ESG has been, on its way probably for at least 20 years, started with an initial focus on climate change that moved towards sustainability and thinking about things like biodiversity and rainforests, but it has evolved even further now to encompass the S and the G functions, social and governance. So thinking about social issues such as fair labor standards and ensuring that we're not exploiting labor from other countries, no bribery, thinking about things such as the diversity of a board of directors or the management within a company, thinking about how climate and environmental risk should be disclosed to the public if you're talking about publicly traded companies. So all of this has now evolved into this notion of ESG. The E portion of it, environmental, which is what I'm most familiar with as an environmental lawyer, is the one that's probably the most developed because these things have stemmed from that. And so you have a little bit more structure there around things such as net zero targets, whereas the S and the G components are evolving right now. But ESG coverage is being driven by a wide range of different interests. So we're going to talk about that a little today. And it's a response to demands from investors, demands from consumers, and then also demands from advocacy groups. At this time, there isn't any mandated reporting platform. All of the ESG coverage is done in a voluntary fashion. However, the Biden administration has shown that it will be bringing a new level of government interest and looking at ESG much more carefully and putting some more structure and regulatory framework around it. So one of the risks of ESG is to any company is access to capital. ESG disclosures are increasingly driving finance and investment decisions. Institutional investors are pledging that they are not going to hold shares in companies that don't disclose their ESG data. Lenders are being pressed to stop giving money to entities that have significant greenhouse gas emissions. Institutional investors are pledging to have carbon-free portfolios. And really, when you're looking at it from the investor side, you see an emphasis on purchasing low carbon and ESG investments, securing board commitments to become carbon neutral, and pushing companies to set target dates by when they will be net zero in terms of their greenhouse gas emissions. In the prior administration, the reaction was to resist these types of efforts. There was a rule that was put in place by the Trump administration that is colloquially called the guns and oil rule. It's kind of a funny name for it. But what it basically did is the comptroller of the currency had prohibited lenders from discriminating against folks who wanted loans that were in businesses such as maybe gun manufacturing or the oil industry, where you would have to give them the loan as long as they qualified, on a financial basis, that it was a push against discriminating against politically unpopular businesses. Another rule, and that rule, by the way, this guns and oil rule, has been revoked by the Biden administration. It is no longer in existence. The Labor Department also put in place some standards under ERISA, and ERISA is the law that governs pension plans. And what it did was it limited the amount of ESG funds that could be covered by retirement plans. And the thinking here was that retirement plans are really a bedrock of, most Americans' wealth and something that they very much count on, and that investments in what are sort of thought to be newfangled ESG funds should be limited to protect the funds of the average American. So far, that regulation has not been touched. There is momentum, as I said, behind putting some structure around ESG, and the Biden administration is expected to push for a very robust agenda in that area. A week after he was inaugurated, President Biden signed an executive order that was called Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad. This was a very wide-ranging executive order that looked at all sorts of things having to do with climate change. But one of the things that it said was that the federal government has to drive assessment, disclosure, and mitigation of climate pollution and climate-related risks in every sector of our economy. That is squarely within the ambit of ESG, and highlights the fact that the president is going to be wanting some type of regulation that requires some type of assessment and disclosure of your climate risk. Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, has also been advocating for some new climate policies. One is an idea that is cap and dividend. She has endorsed a position that had been put forth by the Climate Leadership Council. That was a group that was founded by George Shultz, and it is escaping me who the other person was. James Baker. Sorry, I looked at my notes to remind myself. And what this would basically do is it would cap emissions of greenhouse gases in some form or fashion, and then allowances would either be auctioned off or you would have some type of a tax. But the proceeds from those auctions or that tax would then be distributed at the end of a period, say a year or maybe a couple of years, would be redistributed back to American citizens. And she has endorsed that approach. She's also talked about endorsing the idea of climate stress tests for banks. So making sure that they are able to withstand, climate change, that they're not over invested in areas that might be more hurt from climate change and things like that. One of the things that the Trump administration did in the last months of the administration was it put in place a new SEC rule called the Sk Modernization Rule. That rule, to the chagrin of many SEC commissioners at the time, did not do anything with regard to climate or ESG obligations. The new SEC chair and the Democratic commissioners are now pushing for new ESG rules, and it is widely thought that those will be coming. one of the other things that is being considered is the revocation of that Sk Modernization Rule through what's called the Congressional Review Act. And that has been referred at this time to the Senate Banking Committee for consideration. And for those who may not know, what the Congressional Review Act does is it allows Congress to revoke any regulations that take place in the final number. There's a certain number of legislative days of an administration that they can be undone by a vote of Congress. The SEC has started to already take some action in the ESG area, setting the stage for what we believe are going to be major initiatives in this area. For example, they have hired their first full-time ESG specialist within the Office of the General Counsel. The Division of Corporate Finance has been directed to enhance its focus on climate-related disclosure in public company filings. And it is widely expected that guidance will be coming soon on ESG and climate risk. They've also launched within the SEC Enforcement Division a climate and ESG task force that they say is designed to proactively look for ESG-related misconduct. And out for public comment right now is the SEC has put out a list of 15 questions regarding new ESG reporting requirements. And the deadline for comment on that, if you're interested in it, is June 13th. And the 15 questions ask a whole host of a range of questions about how the SEC should regulate in this area. So, for example, it asks what should the role be of independent standard setters? What scope of emissions should be reported? Should it be scope 1, scope 2, scope 3? And that's just varying different ways of calculating carbon emissions. Your scope 1 emissions are those emissions you directly emit. Scope 2 is the emissions from your supply chain. And scope 3 is the emissions from the consumers of your product. So, how should we look at all of that? How should governance issues be disclosed? All types of questions there. So if this is an area your company's interested in, this is something you might want to look at and consider commenting on. There is also has been an evolution of ESG issues in the courts over the past few years, and you can divide these cases first into sort of two tranches. First, what we would call the truthfulness cases. So in these truthfulness cases, what the companies are getting in trouble for is having made statements that they were going to do certain things and then not following through on them. So, and one of the things to be very careful about if you're a company is distinguishing between an aspiration, which is you can't be held liable for. So you hope to do something, it's your goal to do something, versus you are in fact doing something. So you see here on the slide some things like there was a case against Keurig for deceptive green labeling, where they had the Keurig had said that their K-cups were recyclable, and they were not nearly as recyclable as they claimed, and so they got sued for that. On the company performance side, you see these cases are more about what the companies are actually doing. And it started out as public nuisance cases against electric generating companies and oil companies, and has now morphed into some product liability claims against, primarily big oil companies. You have this product, it's used the way it's designed, it's creating, problems with greenhouse gas emissions. So these cases have had limited success in establishing any new requirements or exacting any kind of major damages, but they put your company in the headlines. They are expensive to defend. They address high-profile issues that implicate your company's reputation and goodwill. And let's talk about some of these cases. Squarely in the spotlight has been ExxonMobil, has been the center of many of these cases involving a whole host of issues. One was a case brought by the state of New York under the state's Martin Act. And what its main allegation was that it found that Exxon had used one proxy cost for greenhouse gases that, in public documents, and then an entirely different proxy cost internally. And they had tried to go after Exxon for that. Recently, New York City just brought a greenwashing case against ExxonMobil. That was just filed within the last month. Other states have also filed actions with claims as broad as unfair practices, fraud, consumer protection, and breach of fiduciary duties. There have also been cases brought against ExxonMobil by their shareholders, both individual shareholders and institutional investors, saying that Exxon has violated the Securities and Exchange Act and defrauded investors with inaccurate financial information in the ESG space. So this is something for companies to keep in mind. I am now going to pass the baton over to my colleague, Aaron Flynn, and let him tell you a little bit about himself and then talk about some practical tips for the industry.
Thank you, Allison. Hello, everybody. Nice to talk with you today. As Allison said, my name is Aaron Flynn. I'm a partner in the D.C. office and actually in the office for a change, which is nice. I have worked with Allison for years now on climate issues and ESG issues, but in the 15 years or so that I've been in private practice, I've mostly known for my Clean Air Act work and probably mostly with traditional air pollutants on things like the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, interstate transport, ozone issues, like the recently promulgated CASPER update rule. And if you Google me, you'll probably, the thing I'm most associated with is the Regional Haze Program and visibility regulation and litigation. So and prior to that, I worked on energy and environmental issues on the Hill and in the White House as well. So a couple thoughts about what companies are asking about ESG issues. When we talk to our clients about this, what we've found is different companies are in very different places with this issue. Some are very sophisticated, have been doing this type of reporting for a long time and have a system in place to take care of these sorts of issues. Other companies are much newer to the space, much newer to the game, and want to know what exactly should we be doing? What are sort of industry best standards right now? And as Allison's talk probably suggests, this is very much a fluid space with a lot of different things happening, a lot of change. So these best practices change a lot too. But I think a couple thoughts that are relevant probably for just about any business at this point in time. Obviously, the SEC is moving quickly, I think, on additional ESG guidance and very likely a rulemaking. We probably will see an executive order on this very issue. In fact, I'm sort of surprised we haven't seen it already, directing various federal agencies to get more involved on this. So to the extent that the SEC is going to be involved in regulating ESG disclosures, your company's departments that manage SEC-mandated disclosures and ESG disclosures should really be integrated. A lot of what we see is, the ESG person is really, one person or two people in the environmental shop of a company that have been used to doing emissions reporting and have those sorts of responsibilities. There really needs to be a much more integrated, broader approach that make sure that what's being done in ESG related filings or reports matches up with the SEC requirements and that you aren't inadvertently including material information in an ESG report but not disclosing it to the SEC and vice versa. And to the extent that you integrate now, once these SEC requirements are in place, you will have some sort of advantage for being there already. Another thing that I think should be clear from Allison's talk about the litigation and especially the Exxon cases there need to be guardrails in place to make sure that you manage your liability exposure. ESG positions, which can sound great and can sound very much like public relations statements, have significant legal consequences if you say the wrong thing, in particular, managing that aspirational statement versus a factual statement type issue. If you said you're pledging to be carbon-free by 2050, the way you say it can have real ramifications for whether you can be held liable for not getting to that goal. You need to have your lawyers, your SEC lawyers and your general counsel's office aware of what you're doing. In addition, having very formal processes in place that are written down to manage how ESG statements are crafted and then put into the public space is really important. Companies tend to get into big trouble when statements are just being, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, and statements are being put out into the public without everyone being on the same page. So where are things going next? I think it's very clear that there are going to be not only regulatory risks from the SEC, but from all corners of the federal government. This administration has been very clear about taking this whole of government approach to addressing the climate issue and racial justice. And that is going to be, I think, very much reflected in what happens coming forward from the administration on this issue. We know that the SEC is working on it, but as Allison said, the Department of Labor has rules. If you look at a piece of legislation that's pending now, and there's actually been a little bit of movement on the Climate Risk and Disclosure Act, that piece of legislation has a role for many different federal agencies to be involved in this process, including EPA, Interior, the Department of Energy. I could certainly see there being a role for the U.S. Trade Representative, which is that office has talked about using its authorities to address some of these issues. The Federal Trade Commission, there are greenwashing cases before the Federal Trade Commission against an oil company right now. The FTC's green guides have not been updated in a while and could definitely be another area where government is acting. So the fact that there's such a broad base of potential regulatory exposure means the folks who are managing these issues for your company need to have that kind of broad management and broad view of what the company's operations are in order to fully address all of those different things. In addition, to the extent that you have very high-level folks with cross-cutting responsibilities running these issues, it means that your company will be in a better position to manage what ESG is going to look like in the future and to be a leader in this area rather than just a follower. Leading off on that, there's definitely a second wave of ESG issues coming, and what those are going to be is difficult to predict, but Allison alluded to, I think, on the very first slide about the evolution of this issue over time and fair labor practices and looking at the entire supply chain for various issues and bribery, all of these things, privacy concerns, all of these things that you wouldn't necessarily have thought as an ESG issue can be pulled into this framework because it is very fluid. So to the extent that there are activists that support a particular issue, that's probably an area where there's going to be pressure to start disclosing. In particular, one of those areas, which I think is perfectly poised to be a big part of ESG going forward, is environmental justice. And I think there'll likely be significant pressure to do more and more on environmental justice and to disclose what you're doing on environmental justice issues going forward. Environmental justice, which is obviously top of mind for lots of different people and is conveniently the next subject that we're going to talk about, is the concept that all people, regardless of their race, their national origin, their income level, should have equal access to the processes by which we make environmental policy and equal protection from environmental harms and public health hazards. And in the ESG space, thinking about ways to adopt policies that address environmental justice issues is obviously a big concern for lots of companies right now, and then figuring out a way to quantify the same way that we now quantify emissions and the way we quantify whether our investments in various companies has an impact on the environment. I think there'll be pressure to find a way to somehow quantify what companies are doing on environmental justice. So I'll turn to environmental justice and kick us off on the next topic of our of our presentation here today. So there's much that could be said about this topic. We don't have tons of time to do it, so I'm just going to dive right into where we are now, even though there's a long history with this issue. But there was clearly going to be some renewed emphasis on this, even in the early days of the leading up to the 2020 election. As you can see in this headline here from the Post, the Trump administration was talking about taking significant new actions on environmental justice issues in the second term if they had had that opportunity to do that. And clearly it is one of very much embedded in the top 4 campaign issues that the Biden campaign and now the Biden administration has identified as their primary targets. Racial justice and climate change sort of being a perfect marriage of these issues. So what has happened since then? On the very first day, one of the first executive orders that the president signed, protecting public health and the environment and restoring science to tackle the climate crisis, which is sort of the broader environmental executive order signed on day 1, there was a statement in there that the federal government, where it has failed to meet its commitment in the past, it must now work to advance environmental justice. So really raising and elevating this issue. There have been clear indications that the administration is going to elevate the issue as well with the folks who have been appointed to key positions in EPA and in other federal agencies who have extensive histories working on environmental justice issues. And then a week after the January 20th order, the climate crisis order that Allison's already talked about, in addition to having a section on domestic domestic climate change issues and international climate change issues, there was an entire section on environmental justice that was just as thorough and exhaustive as the other two. In particular, creating a new White House Interagency Council to coordinate environmental justice activities across the federal government, sort of re-energizing that process from a former Clinton era executive order, and creating a new advisory council as well, a federal advisory committee act type committee to advise the government on environmental justice policies. That committee has been very active already. They've had their first meeting. Their second meeting is scheduled for tomorrow, and they've taken on addressing several things, including things that were in this executive order, DOJ enforcement to address environmental justice issues, but also updating the Clinton-era executive order for the modern days, and looking at the Justice 40 initiative as well, which is all about getting funding, 40% of funding from various government programs to environmental justice communities to address environmental justice issues. So what's going to happen next? Legislation is a possibility. As I said, there was bipartisan interest in this issue not that long ago. In the last Congress, there were over 90 bills that were introduced to address this. 70 of them were actually truly substantive bills, things that did more than just mention environmental justice in passing. There are 46 bills so far in this Congress. That was up from 29 just a couple weeks ago. So these are clearly, there's a lot of momentum to address this issue, even on the Hill. And in particular, I just want to point to one piece of legislation that I think is particularly interesting because it was sponsored by the vice president when she was a senator. It's now been taken up by Senator Tammy Duckworth. It's the Environmental Justice for All Act. And this would be truly game-changing environmental justice legislation, in that it would amend the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It would create a private right of action with punitive and compensatory damages. It would require scoring for regulations and for legislation on environmental justice impacts. And it would really change the way that environmental justice would be addressed in this country. And perhaps it is a sign of what we will do, even if that legislation does not pass. There is a path forward, even in the event of gridlock on Capitol Hill. I know, unheard of to have gridlock on the Hill, but the existing statutes, in particular NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, have many mechanisms for addressing this issue already in place. NEPA is sort of the obvious choice. Frankly, it's been the subject of litigation on this issue for a number of years now already. But the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, all of these statutes have provisions that could be used more effectively or differently to address environmental justice. And there's an EPA publication that actually goes over this in depth. There's a picture of its cover on the slide there. Just one high-level example, setting the NAAQS. Since I'm an air lawyer primarily, you're supposed to set the NAAQS based on susceptible populations. And that could be defined to have a much more of a focus on environmental justice communities, perhaps, than it has in the past. And you could place monitors in environmental justice communities as well to make sure that when you are measuring NAAQS compliance, that those communities and their environmental well-being is being taken into account perhaps more effectively than it has with the current monitoring network. There's obviously many other examples that we could get into. I won't go through 1,000 of them, but we're already seeing EPA taking the initiative here. Shortly after being confirmed to the position, the new administrator put out a statement to the EPA staff extolling the importance of environmental justice, looking to move it forward. And that has already borne fruit. The Office of Enforcement has put out a new memo emphasizing environmental justice settlements and enforcement actions, inspections. So I think we can expect to see significant new action there. That, of course, leads to litigation. This is my slight attempt to do some statistics. There have been a significant uptick in cases since 2018 cases in federal courts focusing on environmental justice. Very few before 2000. So there's a big change here that's been happening, especially in recent years. And more recently, a number of important decisions that have overturned permits or overturned NEPA analyses on the basis of environmental justice considerations. So a couple insights. There's still clearly quite a lot of a gap here because there isn't a statute that's clearly giving environmental justice rights. And there are cases that say the Clinton-era executive order and various state policies that are in place aren't sufficient basis for a cause of action or for a Civil Rights Act violation on their own. Although, as Katie will talk about, there's going to be significant new developments on the state law area. And it's also quite clear, bedrock principle of NEPA, that agencies have to consider alternatives, but they don't necessarily have to pick the outcome that would have the fewest environmental justice impacts, and that there's a lot of discretion, frankly, for agencies to choose and for companies to pursue options that do have impacts on environmental justice communities. However, what's been clear from two really high-profile cases recently, Buckingham and a case regarding the Dakota Access Pipeline, you can't simply do a bare-boned analysis or an analysis that sort of is very cribbed in the way that it looks at issues to avoid looking at environmental justice impacts. If public comments raise a potential environmental justice impact, many courts are not going to let an agency get away with not looking at it and doing a hard look at it as required under NEPA. And you can't simply look to other programs like the NAAQS program in particular, which was a subject in one of the cases, as a cure-all for any environmental justice issue. You have to look at the issue directly and be responsive to the issue. So I know we could talk about the litigation all day. I won't do that. If there are questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them at the end. But now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Katie Gregory, to talk about some of the other developments that are happening in this area.
Thank you, Aaron. I will see your 90 bills and raise you 203, I believe. I can get the slides just. So like I said, my name is Katie Gregory. I work in the consulting office in Atlanta. We are a subsidiary of the law firm, and so we are an integrated public affairs firm. So we do anything from federal, state, and local government relations to multi-state strategies, communications, advocacy, and multiple facets of business development. So what my background, I joined McGuireWoods a few years ago, coming from state environmental regulatory positions. I worked in Alabama for a few years and have spent 14 years in the Georgia Environmental Protection Division. Most of my time also in air quality, some of it in land protection. So now what I do with McGuireWoods and assist most of my clients in environmental policy and bills with the Georgia legislator, educating and conveying those places and helping formulate the legislation in the best way possible. But I also work a lot of industrial clients through agency relations and working through complex permitting strategies, compliance, and enforcement issues. So environmental justice is kind of right at the intersection of both these issues. Like the slide shows, this year in state houses across the U.S., there are approximately 203 bills introduced that had the word environmental justice with them. A lot of these bills were tied to other categories. We call them omnibus bills. So environmental justice may have been grouped in with climate, sustainability and resilience, equity in housing, or transportation, energy. But some of them solely addressed environmental justice. A lot of times states, in the absence of what they see from, like you said, the gridlock from DC, or action not being taken where they feel, will implement this legislation, and the state agencies are then left to implement this as well. So we like to assist in that kind of where the rubber meets the road part. So a lot of these legislation that we saw came through was creating advisory councils or committees that are looking at definitions for this, which can be important on how you define these communities. What are these terms? What does this mean for? Is this just an environmental permitting? Some of them reach into development, some of it into housing. Right now, I think the big topic of conversation is out of New Jersey. New Jersey's legislation that was signed into law had, as they're saying, some teeth to it. There is some clauses that actually allow for the denial of new permit applications for industry that is in these compromised areas. It includes some new environmental impact studies to be done. So it is putting some prescriptive pieces into it, whereas I think a lot of states are kind of taking this, like, let's get this advisory look to it and get the input and the stakeholders engaged and see what is meaningful. So combining legislative interest into, like Aaron referenced, with EPA Administrator Reagan's memo that emphasized his environmental justice perspective and what EPA is going to be doing this with this. And I think two things importantly come to my mind. And the first, that it was stated that strengthening enforcement of violations of Cornerstone environmental statutes. I think for industry in areas that are considered compromised or that become defined that way, and as maps are drawn, it will be very important to engage with these agencies and to understand what this can look like. And I think back to our ESG conversations, if all of a sudden, you're at more of a risk for violations or inspections, this could have impacts across a wide range of issues. Also with that, the other part is this new increase in public meetings and public advisory panels and getting this public interest. So not only does this just add to the timeline of permit issuances for industry and businesses, but with activists and I'll say the internet and people being able to coordinate, you get a lot of strong adversarial voices at points in times, and this can have real implications into the permit and into those actions and what that looks like. Here in Georgia, we kind of saw this in the last few years. We had a lot of interest around ethylene oxide from medical sterilization. So we have seen what 100+ people, community groups, then impact legislation that impacts permit conditions where, some of these companies have draft permits at this point in time that are the most restrictive in the nation. So I think as these legislation comes through that then gets transferred to these state agencies, I think engagement is going to be the name of the game. I think, especially if environmental justice is brought together in omnibus bills, which as a lobbyist, you love them, you hate them, because, it's easy to tack things on, but it's hard to get a vote against it or for it. If there's a lot of things in it, it's, you can't just label it good or bad. There's a whole lot of parts and pieces. So, working at that from the get-go, and then commenting in these stakeholder meetings, having your voice heard and what this rulemaking and how this is, and having that relationship even with your state level people, that you understand what those expectations are going to be as this comes down, is going to be very integral and important for industry as they operate going forward. And I think that it becomes the continuing conversation is important to us as well. And so I think, like I said, as this omnibus part, I will tie into Bernie, that we know as the energy part of this comes into. A lot of this does go into energy and how that ties into the environmental justice and what people in these areas are seeing as well. So I will pass this on over to Bernie Mcnamee. Thank you.
Oh, Bernie, I believe you're muted.
Sorry about that, the classic problem in the Zoom age. Appreciate being here. My name's Bernie Mcnamee. I'm a partner at McGuireWoods, the law firm, and a senior advisor at McGuireWoods Consulting. I rejoined the firm having served as a commissioner on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which obviously dealt with electric, natural gas, and oil issues. I was at the U.S. Department of Energy in 2 leadership positions, worked on Capitol Hill, and have also worked for a number of state attorneys general's offices in both Texas and Virginia. My focus is on energy policy and energy regulation, and we'll get right into it. Clearly, right now, we're in an era of transition. It's an exciting time to be in the energy area. We're going to focus mainly on electric today. And, we know there are a lot of issues out there, and a lot of you are dealing with them. We're having to deal with clean energy standards, carbon pricing, transmission build-out, cost allocation, RTO reform, renewables, storage, distributed energy resources, electric vehicles, blackouts, and reliability. All of those are things that are before us as we go through the energy transition. And President Biden, Congress, and FERC are all focused on addressing these. Now, as we set the table for this, a lot of people throw out terms like net zero and clean energy, and people are using them interchangeably, but it can sometimes be confusing. But kind of the rule of thumb is that net zero, means that at the end of the day that you'll be offsetting your emissions, or you'll be varying like your carbon emissions from natural gas. Where clean energy generally suggests that you'll actually be producing energy from things like wind and solar or hydro. They're not hard and fast rules, but people have started to use those interchangeably, and I think it's sometimes important to focus on what are people actually saying, and this will be important also as we talk about legislation. In terms of the Biden administration, I think everybody's aware that after President Trump had the United States remove itself from the Paris Accords, the international accords on climate, President Biden has had the United States rejoin that accord. Furthermore, the President has taken initiatives to say that we're going to have a net zero energy economy by 2050. And that's not just for electricity, but that's for everything. And as we all know, manufacturing and transportation are major sections of the economy that have emissions and that need to be addressed. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But in terms of the grid, the electric grid, the goal is to have us to be carbon-free by 2035, which used to seem very far away, but now, as we know, it's less than 15 years away. And so President Biden has proposed a large amount of money to start trying to promote the grid. We know for the overall infrastructure bill that it covers many different things, but part of that money would include money for transitioning to more clean energy. And that would be in both research grants, incentives for taxes, and for build out of transmission. And as you're thinking about where is all this money going to be and how do I get access to it, one of the major areas is going to be from the U.S. Department of Energy, where I used to work for a number of years. And there are a number of different sub-agencies within U.S. Department of Energy that will be allocating the money, whether it's for innovative research at ARPA-E or the Assistant Secretary for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, nuclear energy. There's a whole host of areas, and of course cybersecurity, which is going to be something that's going to be more and more important, as we've seen from the Colonial Pipeline issue. But another major area in which we're going to see activity is also going to be FERC. And the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is going to have a driving role in change in the energy transition. And what's going to be interesting about that is a lot of what it wants to do, a lot of what policymakers would like to achieve can be done by FERC under its current authorities. And so it's not going to necessarily have to rely on Congress. But as you're keeping score, there are a number of bills. I'm not going to go through them all in Congress. But one of the big bills, it's an omnibus bill, as we just heard about. It's almost 1,000 pages. It's the Clean Future Act, which is from Representative Pallone of New Jersey, who's chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. And this bill, in its 1,000 pages, would have many of the same goals as the president has offered, such as 100% renewables on the grid by 2035, and also ensuring that we have more investment in the grid. That includes generation facilities, but also trying to make it easier to build long-range, high-voltage transmission, which is a major issue, and we'll talk about in a moment. Another major issue in driving the energy transition is going to be tax credits. There are two major bills right now in the Senate. One is the Clean Energy for America Act, sponsored by Senator Wyden, who's the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. And basically, it's trying to get rid of 40 temporary tax credits. You know, we all know on December 31st, tax credits are about to expire, and there's always this scramble, are they going to survive? And somehow they usually do. The goal is to create a more generic tax credit where you can either get the production tax credit or the investment tax credit. And they're going to really be focused more on do they reduce emissions and get zero emissions, and not really so much as the technology type. One thing to be aware of, however, is the Biden administration is very committed to union membership and Davis-Bacon requirements for prevailing wages. And it is, if under this proposal, those incentives, along with likely the grants that you would get from DOE, wherever, would have to be done with union labor and under prevailing wages. Another similar bill coming from Senator Crapo and from Sheldon Whitehouse on the Finance Committee is also trying to just create technology-focused tax incentives that would basically mature and phase out as you get a mature technology, but then as new technologies come on, that you'd be able to get these new tax credits, with truly trying to use the tax credit as more as an incentive to build and innovate, and less as a ongoing subsidy to whatever the technology is. Now, what we're really seeing is going to be at FERC, and there's a number of issues on the electric jurisdiction side, primarily through the Federal Power Act, that FERC deals with the wholesale resale of energy, transmission rates, and the organized electric markets, what we know as the RTOs and the ISOs. And not all, but many of them have capacity markets, energy markets, and ancillary service markets. FERC also deals with reliability of the bulk power system. Another major issue for particularly a number of renewable developers is PURPA, Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act, which deals with avoided costs and the opportunity to get secure contracts from utilities. And that can be a major issue for driving particularly small renewable facilities. But I want to talk a little bit about the electrification of the grid. And, you know, the discussion is that by 2050, as we electrify everything in the grid, we're going to need to double our consumption of electricity. Well, that means that we're going to double our consumption of electricity, but also the goal is going to be to have it be done with 100% renewable or clean energy resources or net zero resources. So when you think about that, that is a huge transition. It's not just trying to change where we are now, but it's trying to change where we are now and transform it for the future. And that's going to mean an incredibly large amount of kilowatt hours. And as you see on the slide here, we currently use about 4,000 billion kilowatt hours in 2020, and that's during a year in which where we suffered the pandemic. And so the challenges are going to be for FERC and for policymakers are, how are we going to get this new generation? How are we going to double the amount of generation we have? And how are we going to be able to keep reliability? And as people are trying to think about how are we going to invest, where are we going to put the money, where is the opportunity to put shareholder money in order to participate in this, I think it's helpful to look at where we are in current generation capacity. Of course, the number of units and the ability to generate. And we'll see that, natural gas still makes up 43% of our generation capacity, coal 20%, and renewables are 25%, with 16% of that being hydroelectric or non-hydroelectric, solar, wind, biomass, and the other being 9% being hydroelectric. We also see that nuclear is at 9%, and then the other resources make up the rest. But this translates into the generation mix. How are we actually using the electricity? And we see that natural gas is providing 40% of our generation, coal still providing 19%, which is really remarkable when it was only a few years ago, it was 50%. But nuclear, you'll notice, even though it's 9% of the capacity, it's providing 20% of the energy. And that's the same for renewables. And so you see in the graph for 2020 from EIA, kind of how over time our generation has changed, and also is showing what our actual load has done. And the load growth in the United States has been remarkable over the years. And we're just think of that last line at 2020 is really going to have to double. For renewables, it's just once again seeing that really hydro has dominated for renewables for the last 70 years, but we see that we're really seeing wind and then solar starting to increase. But with the electrification of the grid, FERC recognizes that there's some real issues on this, and that we really need to address how are we going to move in this transformation. And so they've established a technical conference to start discussing the electrification of the grid. And some really interesting commentary took place here, and I expect that there's going to be a number of follow-up discussions, including applications by different RTOs about how they want to help meet the reliability needs and how they want to structure their markets in order to meet the transition. But I also expect that we'll see some policy statements coming from FERC trying to say where they think the RTOs and the grid in general should be going. This will also involve RTO reform. Likewise, there was another technical conference dealing with resource adequacy, and for a number of the RTOs, as you may be aware, there are what are called capacity markets and energy markets and ancillary markets. And capacity markets have been a big debate, especially in PJM, ISO New England, and the ISO New York, because they're trying to figure out how to make sure that there's enough resource adequacy to meet the need on the system when you may have energy prices that are not producing enough revenue in order to keep all the generation operating. And so we've seen as we've got more and more renewables and intermittent resources on the grid that we're seeing that price formation is being challenged, and FERC has been trying to figure out how do we do that. The most famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, was the PJM MOPR or MOPR X that basically said that if it's a state-subsidized resources, they cannot participate, not that they can't participate, but that they have to bid in their resources at basically a, for lack of a better description, at what it would have cost to bid it in based on if you didn't have the resource, have the subsidy. It's clear that the current FERC, particularly under Chairman Glick, is intending that to get rid of the MOPR X, and we've also seen PJM itself has started to discuss with stakeholders that it's likely to move to excluding state-sponsored resources from being part of the minimum offer pricing rule. So these are going to be big issues and big fights that I don't see really ending anytime in the near future. Just to give you an idea where the ISOs are, I think most of you are familiar. Of course, Texas is not under FERC jurisdiction, and it doesn't have a capacity market. And we'll talk at the end about some of the issues that happen there. Another issue that's going to be important for price formation and how things work out in the electric markets is going to be on carbon pricing. FERC recently issued a policy statement inviting the RTOs to propose ways to deal with carbon pricing and have state decisions about how carbon should be priced for generation to be bid into the market. The big issue there is if one state has a different rule or doesn't have carbon pricing at all, but they're all bidding into a multi-state market, how do you equalize those prices? Who's going to pay? Do you add on a price to one state that doesn't have carbon pricing, so those customers have to pay? It's not as easy as it may seem, and it'll be interesting to see how the different RTOs propose this. And I anticipate that it will be easier to do in those RTOs that are covered by a single state, such as New York. I think it's going to be much more complicated in places like PJM. One of the big issues is going to be transmission. This is perhaps one of the biggest challenges for the transition in the grid. It's how to get the transmission built out. One of the big issues is building high voltage transmission lines, particularly from the wind in the Midwest, and getting them to the coast where all the population and load is. And of course, the challenges have been seen in the past with trying to build some of those transmission lines, because the states are who has the authority to cite and approve those transmission lines under current law. And we've seen that, lots of people, for the same reason they don't want natural gas pipelines going through the backyard, they don't want high voltage transmission going through their backyard or through their farmland. There's further issues with transmission than just the big transmission lines, though. It's how are you going to plan the transmission grid? There's fights between supplemental projects and the big projects. Who's going to pay for those? There's a challenge about, it makes more economic sense to build a lot of capacity in the transmission grid, but the problem is that costs more money, and you may not need it all right away. So, how do you incent the investment now for need later on? Who do you allocate those costs to? And then practical issues of the cost to, if you have a new wind or solar facility, there are costs to integrate into the existing transmission system. You have to get into a RTO queue. There may be upgrades that have to be done after the planning, and it can become very complicated. Another big issue is on transmission for wind. We saw Vineyard Wind was just approved yesterday by the Office of Ocean Energy Management, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management yesterday. But the issues of getting those cables, figuring out where they're going to be, where are they going to interconnect with the onshore grid, variety of issues. There will also be state jurisdictional issues, local jurisdictional issues. So the transition is going to be complicated just by practical issues, the political issues, the money issues. We also see that the transition of the grid, FERC has been trying to help move it along in terms of trying to make it easier for storage to participate in the wholesale markets. That was Order 841 and 841A. Also, we see for distributed energy resources that there's been a lot of work to try and make sure that distributed solar, distributed demand response, and maybe small batteries, including EVs, could be aggregated and bid into the markets in order to be able to provide energy to the grid. And so Order 2222 and 2222A were major steps forward in FERC trying to allow the grid to use these. Big issue looming, they also asked for a notice of inquiry about whether to remove the state opt-out for demand response programs. Electric vehicles are going to be another big issue. We all see the move wanting more electric vehicles, but the practical issues are going to be, once again, having generation, how to build out the transmission. There's going to be charging stations, but also jurisdiction. You're going to have issues with the states and the public utility commissions and the local utilities. You're going to have battles between, is it going to be the Wawas or the BPs that are going to own the charging stations? Is it going to be the utilities? These are all going to be practical issues that are going to have to be dealt with, and that McGuireWoods and McGuireWoods Consulting is already starting to engage with, both at the federal and the state level. Reliability is going to be a major issue, and without going too much into it, the duck curve helps explain some of the big challenges. In California, we see that whereas the top gray line is where the load usually is, that bottom line is where behind the meter generation might be coming with solar. All's well and good on the grid until you reach about 4:30 in the afternoon, and suddenly you need a huge amount of energy all of a sudden, and where are you going to get it from? And currently, natural gas is one of the big sources from that, But as we see moves to get rid of natural gas and other fossil fuels, the ability to find ramping sources before major storage comes available, it's going to be very difficult. And so I'll leave you with just the basic idea of it's all going to come down to, to build out the grid, $4 to $6 trillion going to be needed to be invested, great investment opportunities, but there are big costs with that. And I think we always need to be worried about what a rate shock and energy rationing. And with our few moments, I'll say thank you for joining us and appreciate it. And I know we had a question and answer area. Sorry, we haven't been able to get to it, but we will also try and answer them after we all get off. So thank you so much, and we appreciate your time.
Yeah, we have your email addresses if you submitted a question, and we'll get back to you that way.